Last time we were talking in general about the book of Deuteronomy. I gave you a kind of outline and said some general things about it. I want to continue that today and talk specifically about what might be called the theology of the core of Deuteronomy. Unlike the Torah as a whole, or even the documents that are thought to make it up, namely J, E, and P, it's hard to say that there is any real pattern to this material outside of a kind of chronological setting, that one event follows another, and we're generally moving from creation all the way to the wandering in the wilderness in preparation for entering the land. So there is a kind of chronological organization to the Torah. But Deuteronomy is quite clear in its theological assertions, and that is not always true of our Pentateuchal sources. So I've already said that one of the characteristics of Deuteronomy is the kind of redundancy that it has in the language. It wants to be absolutely clear about what it expects and what it means, and so it does that in rather plain language, and then repeats it, and it repeats it again, and it repeats it again, and eventually you're going to get it, right? So that's the tactic, that's the exhortatory tactic that our writer uses. So it's not too difficult to piece together and sort of abstract from all of this, and much of it is laid out for you in the chapters 5 through 11. That is the introduction to what some people consider to be the legal section itself, which would begin in chapter 12. So we're going to, sort of pass over the question of whether that's the right division. We're going to look mostly now at the beginning exhortation, beginning in chapter 5, and we'll sort of stop that around chapter 11, and from there we'll move on. And the clear points that the Deuteronomist wants to make in theological terms here are the following. The first is the importance of covenant. Now, we've run into covenants before, but Deuteronomy has a great deal invested in the notion of covenant and has a very distinctive way of looking at it, which is different from the other covenants we have considered. We've looked at the Yahweh's covenant, we've looked at the priestly writer's covenant, first with the whole of creation and then with Abraham specifically. We've seen what the characteristics of those covenants are. Deuteronomy has a very different take on covenant. This possibly has something to do with the fact that we are making an educated guess that the final form, or at least a penultimate form of Deuteronomy, comes to us from the Assyrian period, where the Assyrian Empire is putting strong pressure on Israel, both north and south. Eventually, as you know from your reading in history, it will capture the northern kingdom and transplant the population of the north. It makes the same attempt to do this in the south, in Judah, and for the same reasons, the violation of these international treaties that the Assyrians used to enforce a peaceful empire. So the Assyrians made the effort. They do invade Judah at various times. They do make treaty arrangements with various Israelite or Judean kings, most notably Asa and Hezekiah, and later on probably Josiah, although that one is not as clear. So it's being used to try to regulate Judah. Judah, however, manages to survive an Assyrian destruction. Nevertheless, the people certainly would have known about these covenants and treaties that the Assyrians used as a means of international control. So it is probably no accident that Deuteronomy places the emphasis that it does on these treaties. Now, there has been some argument about this recently. There are a few scholars who think that there really are no references to treaty here, and it's not an important item. I don't really understand how people can say that. Deuteronomy itself seems to be insistent on the covenant idea and has a very distinctive way of looking at it, and we'll see that almost immediately. So covenant is one of the central images. After we've talked about the importance of covenant for Deuteronomy, we'll move on to talk about a specifically theological assertion, namely the notion of one God for Israel, which is a hallmark of Deuteronomic thinking. And we'll move on from one God to one people to one sanctuary, which will bring us into the section which might be called the introduction to the polity. The polity section begins with an assertion of laws having to do with the sanctuary. This is an old Near Eastern custom. These law codes seem to begin generally with a law that governs the worship of the deity. And so Deuteronomy does the same thing in chapter 12 and talks about the place where the one God is to be worshiped. And if you look back at your the original version of the Ten Commandments, you remember in Exodus, you remember that they are followed immediately by the covenant code, and the first words of the covenant code are, "An altar of earth you shall build," and then it goes on with the restrictions on how you will build an altar for the worship of Yahweh. So these codes all seem to begin with this kind of interest in the worship of the deity, and Deuteronomy here is no exception. So the law of the altar begins the polity section, and the rest of it is all an assertion, which is less better organized, of what the great society looks like according to the Deuteronomists. What does Deuteronomy land look like if the people actually follow the laws that are made in Deuteronomy? So we'll spend some time looking at the polity that the Deuteronomists seem to have wanted Israel to follow, and which, according to their own testimony, particularly later on in Joshua, Judges, and Kings, their own retrospective on their history indicates that absolutely nobody paid any attention to the Deuteronomists whatsoever. It was a reform program which never really fully managed to catch on. And that, according to the Deuteronomic version of things, is precisely why the kingdoms both fell. Had they done something differently, it would have all turned out much better. What it would have looked like is not very clear to anybody. Like most reform programs, it not only was not fully implemented, it was probably even barely partially implemented. So we'll take a look at that and how it finally then cashes out in the Deuteronomistic history. But we want to begin with covenant, which is one of the central images used by the Deuteronomists to express the relationship between God and Israel. The image itself appears at the very beginning of the central section of the book. And in it you begin to see some of the ideas about covenant which mark the Deuteronomistic historian. It's precisely this beginning in chapter 5 that makes it hard for me to understand how anybody would say that covenant is not important to the Deuteronomists, because they really do begin with it right out of the gate in chapter 5. So Moses convened all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the ordinances that I am addressing to you today. You shall learn them and observe them diligently. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb." That's the opening of the legal section. So it is a back reference to the covenant at Sinai, which Deuteronomy consistently gives its northern name Horeb to. And so every place else in the Torah that's called Sinai, here Deuteronomy calls it Horeb, which I think is probably a northern designation for the mountain. But notice how this now goes on. By implication, beginning this way, the Lord made a covenant with us at Horeb. By implication, although not explicitly, all of the laws which follow are to be seen as part of Israel's covenant obligation. Deuteronomy 5 begins by recalling to the people the covenant which was made at Horeb, where for the first and only time God spoke directly to the people, and as part of their covenant obligation gave them the commands contained in the Decalogue. Remember how that Exodus passage was shaped, that God seems to have given directly to the people the 10 commands that make up our Decalogue. After that, remember, the people were so terrified by hearing the voice of God and being somewhat surprised that they still lived to tell about it, but they didn't want to repeat the experience. They thought it was just a dreadful thing to do, and they told Moses, all right, look, if you want to go up there and talk to that deity, you go right ahead and come back and let us know what God has to tell us. But we do not want to listen again to the voice of God. There is a sermon in that, but that is very clearly the package, and the idea that that is the way things happened is really based on the packaging in Deuteronomy. It is the way that the Deuteronomist thinks about this that has influenced the way that the Exodus passage has been arranged, so that all of the sources now agree on this point, that the Decalogue was given directly, the rest of the law was given secondarily. And that is laid out for us here right at the very beginning. Still, the covenant is not here presented as a past event which Israel only remembers, and this is a very distinctive Deuteronomic feature. Rather, at the very beginning of chapter 5, the writer makes a point which will be repeated at various points and in various ways throughout the rest of the book. Yahweh makes a covenant with each new generation. And so immediately after the introductory words in chapter 5, the Lord made a covenant with us at Horeb, come these words, not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here, alive, today. Notice how emphatic that is. This is a good example, incidentally, of Deuteronomic rhetoric. This repetition of words that drive home the point. This is not the first time. It's not a claim that the ancestors didn't really hear the voice of God. It is simply a claim that this thing is going to be repeated from generation to generation. Each person will now stand, as it were, at Sinai and hear these same words which their ancestors heard. And they will now be called on to respond just as the ancestors were called on to respond. So the covenant for Deuteronomy is not conceived here as something which was done once and not repeated, but as something which each generation must undertake. In that sense, the ritual of Passover, among other things, has it right that each generation stands at Sinai and faces the choice of accepting or rejecting. The words of the Passover Haggadah stress this present sense of Exodus and its subsequent thing. The Holy One, blessed be He, did not simply take our ancestors out of Egypt, us too God redeemed. All of us who are here today, taking a phrase from Deuteronomy. So there is this presentness of covenant in the way that Deuteronomy thinks about it. That has both a positive and a negative side to it, as I already said. Each new generation has to make the decision all over again. That's the negative side of it. The positive side of it is that each new generation has the chance to make it over again. So there is this sense that if you messed it up the first time, there is still another opportunity for the next generation. And this kind of generational thinking is going to mark Deuteronomy, that it's a way of beginning to develop a very important theological idea, which is that God's transactions with Israel are never finally completed, that there is a kind of ongoing character to God's relationship to Israel, and it is in this that the community will have great hope in the light of the Babylonian exile and later on when the community is dispersed, that God is not through with Israel. But there's going to be another opportunity. There will be another covenant that has to be faced. There will be another opportunity to either take it or leave it. So this is a kind of ongoing process that Deuteronomy is sketching out. The book of Deuteronomy itself, of course, ends with the making of a covenant for the people who are standing there listening to Moses give them the book of Deuteronomy, which makes perfect sense. The book of Deuteronomy lays out what is involved in the people's covenant obligations and what this treaty must be all about. And so the generation that grew up in the wilderness and is given the opportunity in chapters 27 and 28 to again renew the covenant that their ancestors made at Horeb. They'll have another chance, we'll see, in Joshua 24, when the people have finally completed, according to Joshua anyway, have completed the conquest of the land. They will be told by Joshua, now we have to do it all over again. We have to face this covenant, and we have to decide whether we're going to obey it now that we are in the land. And I don't know what you are going to do, Joshua says, but me and my house will serve Yahweh. And of course the people rashly say, we too will do that. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take on ourselves the demand of the covenant. Joshua says, are you sure you're up to this? And the people say, oh yes, we can do this, and of course immediately begin merrily violating it, as having actually already done so, but we will get there shortly. All right, so it's this repetitive quality. This is how the new wilderness generation, which did not actually participate in the Horeb covenant, is to accept for itself the demands of that covenant. When the people enter the land, they will have another covenant ceremony, and so on and on it goes. As a kind of sideline to this, Deuteronomy thinks that it is important that each generation fully understand what is involved in making and accepting the covenant, and that, of course, is the rationale for this kind of repetitive insistence on what Israel's obligations are. This seems to be the reason for this kind of exhortatory rhetoric that marks Deuteronomy. They are constantly exhorting people to obey, and you have to keep exhorting them to obey because it's an ongoing sort of process. It also means, and this is the second point, that education is terribly important for the Deuteronomists. It is the responsibility of each new generation to be taught by their predecessors what the demands of the covenant are. And it is out of this idea that we get much of the liturgical language that surrounds things like the Passover, Haggadah, where the children of the family are to ask the questions of their elders. Why is this night different from all other nights of the year? And this becomes a teaching moment. This is the time when the elders are to reply, this is because God saw our slavery in Egypt and brought us out of Egypt, and so on and so on. So Deuteronomy is simply full of these sorts of teaching moments, and they stress them in a way that none of the other sources do. Take a look, for example, at chapter 6. We're going to return to this later on. But beginning around verse 7, this is 6. Keep these words which I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them, repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So there is this constant need to remind everyone involved in this. Going on to verse 20, which recalls exactly the moment that I described in the Passover Seder. When your children ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of the decrees and the statutes and the ordinances? Notice this traditional Deuteronomic repetition. The decrees, the statutes, and the ordinances, every time one of them comes up, the other two will come up as well. There probably is a distinction in the minds of the Deuteronomists, but exactly what it is we're not real clear about. But they're being absolutely inclusive here of what God's demands are going to look like. So when your children ask you in the future, what is the meaning of the decrees and the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord our God has commanded you? Notice how that is. You, the children, have not yet made their decision about covenant, but it is the job of the parents to bring them to the point where they are ready to do that. This is the way Deuteronomy now goes on with this. Then you shall say to your children, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. You can almost hear the organ music playing in the background here. This is a typical confession on the part of the Deuteronomists, and it is very close to the much longer one which we will see in Deuteronomy chapter 26, when the people are given instructions on bringing the first fruits of the ground to the sanctuary. And when you bring the first fruits, this is not just an offering to the deity. It is the moment when the worshiper is to recite precisely this. And a wandering Aramean was my ancestor, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there. And there he became a nation, mighty and populous, and so on. And the Egyptians oppressed us and treated us with hard bondage. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt. Here comes the recitation of that line. The Exodus is more important for Deuteronomy than probably anything else, theologically. It's not the ancestors so much, although Deuteronomy mentions the ancestors and is really appreciative of the ancestors and acknowledges that God actually is acting on their behalf because of promises that were made to the ancestors. But the real core of the Deuteronomic theological event is this leading out of Egypt, which keeps coming up over and over again as a kind of reminder. So this is what the parents are to respond to the children. And the Lord displayed before our eyes great and awesome signs and wonders against Pharaoh. This is Deuteronomy's version of the 10 plagues. But notice that there is no detail given. These are simply signs and wonders done upon Pharaoh by Yahweh. And it is this which becomes the groundwork for this covenant which God is going to make at Horeb. And so on, and it goes on at great length. So the covenant is two-sided. And it's always important when you're talking about covenants to remember this fact. We tend to forget about it as if it were our responsibility to make a covenant with Yahweh. That's not the way it works. Yahweh makes a covenant with us, and it is a kind of two-sided arrangement. And this is important. We saw the purest example of that was this peculiar covenant between the two pieces that Abraham made with Yahweh, where the initiative was totally on the part of Yahweh, and where there was no express responsibility for Abraham under this covenant. He did not have to do anything. The only thing he brought to that covenant was his belief in what God had promised. So there is no new obligation that Abraham has laid on him according to that covenant. Not so the way Deuteronomy wants to think of this, but it's important to remember that it is a two-sided covenant. It binds both Yahweh and Israel. On the one hand, Yahweh promises that Israel will be the people of God, people who have been specially chosen by God. And we begin to get here the roots of a kind of theology of divine choice. Why Israel for this and not some other nation? Deuteronomy does not go into that at all, but is absolutely clear that that is what is going on, that God has specially chosen Israel. Chapter 7, verse 6. You are a people holy to the Lord your God, that is set aside for the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on earth to be his people, his treasured possession. So there's a very strong election doctrine here. Now, later on, when some of the prophets like Amos get hold of this, Israel is going to be reminded that God chose Israel, fair enough, but God may well have chosen some other nations too for other purposes. And the implication of the prophet is clearly that, well, maybe God has other deals with other people, and you are not the only ones. And Deuteronomy sort of thinks that way too when it gets to what monotheism means for Israel. We'll see momentarily that when God talks about the choice of Israel, that's about enough for Israel to worry about. You know, you worry about Yahweh. Yahweh is your deity. Other people may have other gods. Don't worry about that. That's their problem. They can work with that. But your responsibility is the worship of Yahweh, and that's quite enough for you to be concerned with. Don't get into other people's business, which is an interesting and very helpful and very early reminder of that. It's a kind of egalitarian theology, if you like. The covenant community has its responsibilities, and other communities have their responsibilities. All right, so they are a specially chosen people. In addition, Yahweh has sworn to give the people the land. This is a very central theme in Deuteronomy. The tangible sign of God's choice of Israel is giving them the land. Now, this is going to be turned in later thinking in a kind of destructive way that holds out the land and its possession as a tangible sign of what Israel is. That begins, of course, to run into problems with the dispersion around the turn of the era in its final form, where the land is no longer Israel's to have. And what then do you do? What happens to this promise of land? And that's a major issue down to this day, which is never completely resolved, either in politics or in theology. But the land for Deuteronomy is the tangible sign that Yahweh has elected the people. So chapter 6, verse 10. When the Lord your God has brought you into the land that he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, just in case you have forgotten who they are, to give you a land with fine and large cities that you did not build, houses filled with all sorts of goods that you did not fill, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, And when you have eaten your fill, be careful that you do not forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. The Lord your God you shall fear, and him you shall serve. By his name alone you shall swear. Do not follow any of the other gods of the peoples around you. So the land comes with dangers. There are people already there, and you have got to figure out how to get along with them. And Deuteronomy is going to tell you that it's a really bad idea to mix with the people who are nearby. Why? Because they are going to lure you into the practices of worshiping their gods. So it will be hard, if not impossible, for you to maintain the chief Deuteronomic command, which is the worship of the one God. And so, Deuteronomy knows that these people exist and thinks that the best way to deal with them is simply to leave them alone and not mix with them religiously or socially. So that's the solution. Whether or not you are supposed to exterminate them is another matter. And here Deuteronomy does not give you any particular guidance. So those are the obligations which God keeps toward Israel. That's Yahweh's part of the covenant. And Israel, for its part, agrees to love God. Now, this seems pretty straightforward. But the command to love God as a command in our legal corpus occurs only and for the first time in Deuteronomy. Other places tell you to worship or to fear God. Deuteronomy says that you have an obligation to love God. And it is their exegesis of the great statement of faith, which we will return to several times in a minute when we get to the business of the one God. It begins in 6:4, the so-called Shema, after the first words in Hebrew. Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Yahweh our God is one, which becomes the central theological affirmation of Judaism. This is ritually the first prayer which is said in the morning and the last prayer which is to be said at night, and so on. There is this constant reminder of this affirmation, and I'll return to what Deuteronomy thinks it means a bit later on. But notice where this goes. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the Lord alone, which I think is probably the correct translation of it, but I'll return to that later. This is NRSV I'm reading. You will find that this is different from RSV, and practically every translation has its own rendering of these words, and I'll get to why that is so. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So the command to love God is the first obligation which Israel sees as coming, or Deuteronomy sees as coming from this insistence on the one God and the belief in the one God. You shall love the Lord your God. It comes again in 10:12, 11:1, so it's frequently mentioned in this exhortatory beginning. Our problem is that we have a tendency to trivialize that, and we cannot trivialize it. Deuteronomy, in talking about the love of God, is not talking about some kind of slushy romantic love. It's not a sort of vague emotion. It's not feeling good about God. And there are many things that have entered our common discourse about what love means. And Deuteronomy has a much more robust notion of what love involves. Love for Deuteronomy has to be seen, first of all, in the context of the covenant. Love is owed to God as an obligation. So it has a covenantal setting. It is also concretely defined. It is not a kind of generalization. If you want to know what it means to love God, here is the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy says, look, here's all this stuff you're supposed to be doing. Here are all your obligations spelled out for you. That's what it means to love God. These are the signs that you love God. So you see that in places like 11:1. You shall love the Lord your God, therefore keep his charge, his decrees, his ordinances, and his commandments always. So there is a very explicit idea in Deuteronomy of just about what love involves. And it's not left to your imagination, it's not left to your emotion for Deuteronomy. There's a very explicit description. So love as an emotion has to be worked out in action in the world and in the way that Israel lives. So Deuteronomy is very clear about that. And finally, as we saw in 6:4 and following, love, as Deuteronomy thinks about it, is an act of the entire being. It involves all of the senses of an individual. Okay, so that is the insistence of Deuteronomy on covenant and what seems to follow from it. From there, we want to move on to the claim that there is only one God for Israel. It is no accident that the legal section actually begins back in chapter 5. And in chapter 5, we have repeated for us the Decalogue. This is Deuteronomy's version of the Decalogue. It is slightly different from the one in Exodus. If you want to have a good time sometime, don't have anything else to do, look at the differences between these two versions. Generally speaking, they are pretty much identical, but there are minor differences which are interesting to ponder. Deuteronomy is much more likely to give you reasons for doing what you are asked to do by the Decalogue, so you don't mistreat your parents because you were slaves in Egypt. You know what it was like to be mistreated, and so on. So they all, you are given more reason, let's put it that way, for obeying that. And that's consistent with this complex theological system that Deuteronomy is laying out for you. There are reasons for doing this. You don't just do it because God said to do it. So Deuteronomy has some practical advice as well as other things. The great statement of Israelite monotheism is, of course, in 6:4, which now follows in the present text the first words that Moses now passes on to the people after giving them the Decalogue. So this is a Deuteronomic version in a way of the covenant code, the first legal collection that follows the Decalogue. And that opens with this Shema in verse 4. It's chapter 6, verse 4. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel. That part is clear. It begins with a summons for people to hear. Just what are they supposed to hear? They are supposed to hear Adonai Eloheinu, Yahweh our God, Adonai Echad. That's the problem. There is no verb in that clause. The Hebrew simply says, Yahweh our God, one Yahweh. No verb. English requires verbs, and translating this into English is a problem. If you look at the various efforts at doing this, you will see that translators are sort of all over the map in the different ways in which that verbless clause might be translated. And it makes some difference. Let me run through the most common translations. The NRSV translates Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone is our God. In other words, it's a kind of comparative sentence. My guess is that syntactically that's probably what this means. That is, it's the assertion that Yahweh is Israel's God, that is clear. And not only that, Yahweh is Israel's only God, which is the strong statement of a monotheism. But others translate it differently. Yahweh is our God, one, which immediately makes you want to ask, one what? One God. So it is not as clear. The old RSV translation, Yahweh our God is one, simply makes it into the sentence. And again, one, not only one what, but what is being affirmed and denied. Does it mean that the being of Yahweh is not split in some way? Does one mean whole? I mean, theologically, it's like the revelation of the divine name to Moses. Exactly what is being revealed is not as clear as you would like it to be. Others translate Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. That doesn't help the story. Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. Our one God is Yahweh, emphatic Yahweh, as if there are some other choices out there that are being explicitly ruled out. It's very hard to know from even historical context, let alone language, exactly what is being affirmed here and what is not. The book of Deuteronomy itself will begin to chip away at that ambiguity of what is being said here, and they are going to make a few other things explicit as they go along. It is also the case that the more we dig up, literally, archaeologically from the area around Israel, the more we realize that there is a practice in texts well demonstrated in Mesopotamia and Levantine texts of thinking of deities locally. So, for example, in the middle of the second millennium BC at Ugarit, this site from which we have so many tablets, at least until ISIS blew it up recently, there are references to the Baal of, followed by the names of a half dozen different cities. What we don't know is whether the high god Baal, who is the subject of the myths, whether the high god Baal was really considered to be the Baal being talked about in this list. That is, are each of these, the Baal of Ugarit, the Baal of Taman, the Baal of somebody else, are these all the same Baal with simply different addresses? So maybe, they spend the month of Adar in this place and they move to some other place and it gets too hot. Anyway, or are these conceived of as actually separate deities? The Baal of Ugarit is different from the Baal of Taman. We don't know the answer to that question because we can't ask them, and we really don't know how we thought about it. At Kuntil Rud, we have a reference to Yahweh of Samaria, and we of course know from the Bible that Yahweh was worshipped in Samaria. There probably is a Yahweh temple in Samaria, in spite of Deuteronomy's claim that that should not have happened. And there is also a Yahweh of Taman, which is in the south near the border with Edom. Are these really two separate Yahwehs? Or are these the same Yahweh? We don't know that. But this assertion that Yahweh is one may have something to do with that. I always thought that was a kind of nonsensical phrase that Deuteronomy might be trying to put out. But in context, maybe it's not such a nonsensical phrase. Maybe it is saying that you will see references to Yahweh, as we do at this site called Kuntila Dajarud, which is down in the south, not very far from the area of Edom. It's on the trade route down there. Maybe it is an assertion that when you see Yahweh of Samaria and Yahweh of Teman, these really are the same Yahweh, and they are also the same as the Yahweh who is worshipped in Jerusalem, for which we have epigraphic evidence also, and a denial of the claim that these are separate deities in some way. So in that case, they would be taking a kind of decisive step toward monotheism and the notion that they worship only one God. It is clear that for Deuteronomy, the worship of the one God means precisely that. Israel is to worship only Yahweh. There are no other options, and they are very clear about that in this introductory material and later on. Along with the command to worship only Yahweh, there is also a ban on other gods. So 6:14, for example, be careful that you do not forget Yahweh your God. I'm starting at verse 12, chapter 6, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. Yahweh your God you shall fear, him you shall serve, by his name alone you shall swear. Do not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who are all around you, because the Lord your God, who is present with you, is a jealous God, and the anger of the Lord your God would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you from the face of the earth. Talk about a motive clause. That's why you don't worship other gods, because Yahweh really does not like you worshiping other gods. And God is going to do things that you will not like to keep you from worshiping other gods. And this motif of the non-worship of the other gods is repeated several times in this early introductory material. At the same time, the nations are recognized as worshiping these other gods, and Deuteronomy just says, don't do that. Let them worship other gods if they want to. That's their business. So it is not in that sense a pure theoretical monotheism. It is not a claim that other gods do not exist. It's just a claim that Israel has no business worshiping other gods. Now, when we get to, in the second semester, when we get to the exilic portion of the book of Isaiah, you'll see a totally different take on this monotheism. There you have, for the first time, a genuine theoretical monotheism, where you have God saying, I am Yahweh, there is no other. That's the denial of the existence of other gods. I do good and I create evil. That's the downside of a pure monotheism. You have to attribute all activity, whether good or ill, to the one God. And that is a steep price to pay for a theoretical monotheism. You can see why in the exilic setting where other gods were commonly known, and in fact Isaiah has wonderful descriptions of the divine statues that were used in worship in Mesopotamia, and he says, look, you've got these statues. He knows how they're made. He describes the making of a divine statue in great detail. And he says, the funniest thing I've ever seen, they put the stuff together and then they fall down and they worship it thinking it's a deity. And he just doesn't understand the logic of that. These things are not deities. And it's the affirmation, not only in the existence and the necessity of worshiping Yahweh, but also the claim that other gods really are not gods at all, and that you are therefore not to have anything to do with them. if only for practical reasons. They're not going to do you any good. So Isaiah has moved from the Deuteronomic perspective of one God for Israel to the notion that there is only one God in the cosmos. And that is an affirmation which you will see again in the priestly material in the Torah, and it is a necessity in the context of the exile. All right, we'll move on from there to the other claims that Deuteronomy wants to make. We'll talk about those on Friday.